Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the first episode of Contender. My name is Gage Ryan, and I am your host of this podcast. So, episode 1, for those that obviously don't know, this is going to be an MMA-centered podcast. We may dip into some other things here and there, but this is an MMA-centered podcast. A little bit about me. I've been an MMA fan for quite a while nowadays. I primarily focus on the UFC, but I will be discussing Bellator, ONE FC, and some other promotions here and there when the time permits. But to start things off, a big topic that I wanted to get into was the Cyborg Nunes fight that just took place. This is post UFC 232, and I gotta tell you, it was one of the more interesting events in recent memory. You have Cyborg versus Nunes, Jones versus Gustafsson, and I'll tell you what, they're both two real big main events that I enjoyed watching, for different reasons, I would say. But so the whole thing is that I'm interested in seeing where things go from here in terms of who's Nunes going to fight, who's Gustafsson going to fight, who's Jones going to fight, who's Cyborg going to fight now that she's a free agent. It's an interesting, a spot that we're being put in right now, where you have these big names. Nunes is a bigger name by the second. She's not, let's say, as big of a name as someone like, let's say, Ronda Rousey, for obvious reasons. Nunes isn't a household name yet. I do believe she could get there. I mean, she has a lot of things going for her. She's arguably the greatest women's fighter of all time. Beat the shit out of Ronda Rousey. Beat the shit out of Miesha Tate. Beat the shit out of Chris Cyborg. She has just run through this division. She had a couple losses here and there early in her career. She lost to Kat Zingano, for instance. But I'll tell you what, man, ever since she's been on this tear, she has not deviated from it in the slightest. I think Nunes could get to a level of Ronda Rousey if she was able to if she was willing, I should say, to put the work in for more media or whatever the case calls for. The thing about being a star in the business, it's not a foregone conclusion. It's not like you do A, B, C, D, and all of a sudden you're a household name. There's people that have been on opposite sides of the spectrum, and they both end up at the same destination, and it doesn't really make a lot of sense. You have Ronda Rousey, who is the first ever, female ass kicker. You know what I mean? She had this aura about her that she couldn't be beat. You saw in all these interviews of her, of the taglines of "Don't be a do-nothing bitch," or whatever you want to say. I still use that line, actually. Where you have all these different ideas in motion, and nobody thought that she was going to lose. I surely didn't think she was going to lose. I wasn't quite as educated on the sport, if I can use that term, as I am now. But back then, I gotta tell you, the Holly Holm loss, as I was watching Ronda come out, I said she looks defeated already, I think were my exact words. And lo and behold, she lost. But up until that point, she was a rock star. She was the biggest name in the sport by a country mile. This time Conor McGregor wasn't quite where he is now. I think he had maybe just made it into the UFC, or he had just beaten, let's say, Poirier or Seaver, so he still had a lot of momentum, but he wasn't nearly on Ronda's level at the time. And then you have, let's say, someone like Conor McGregor, who has the same sort of idea, but he's not this face of mixed martial arts. He's Conor McGregor, if that makes sense. Ronda Rousey, for a couple solid years, was known as females mixed martial arts. She single-handedly, almost, got women's MMA into the UFC. After Dana White going on record saying that women would never fight in the UFC and this, that, blah, 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 and then all of a sudden, one thing leads to another, and before long, he's promoting Ronda Rousey to the first UFC Women's Bantamweight Championship. Whereas Conor McGregor, you look at what he's done, and essentially he has an entire country behind him, for starters. He has an entire country behind him, and he came into the UFC with a massive amount of popularity. He wasn't this pop culture icon, but when he got to the UFC, he was already a big name, let's say, within the hardcores, and anybody within Ireland, anybody, even in the same, zone, let's say, zip code. Not necessarily zip code, but anybody in the Ireland area, I should say, knew who Conor McGregor was, and that hasn't changed at all. His popularity hasn't waned the slightest bit, maybe a little bit after the Khabib Nurmagomedov fight, but that's only a certain amount. But so my whole point, I think that Nunes can be that star. I think that Amanda Nunes could become that Ronda Rousey. I don't know about Conor McGregor level, but we'll say that Ronda Rousey level. She has a lot of things going for her. She's arguably the greatest women's MMA fighter of all time. And really, it's like, who else are you going to make an argument for? You can't make it for Cyborg. I mean, for one, she's been busted with steroids however many times. You sure as shit can't make, and plus Amanda Nunes just knocked her out. You sure as hell can't make it for, let's say, Ronda Rousey, Miesha Tate. Plenty of people have beaten Miesha Tate. No disrespect to Miesha Tate. It is what it is. It's interesting. So I think that really you can't make an argument for anybody else. So you have Amanda Nunes, who's probably the greatest female fighter of all time, at least right now, who's also the first openly gay MMA champion, who also took out in 50 seconds, I think it was, who many people consider to be the greatest female fighter of all time, in Chris Cyborg. I mean, they made an entire division for her in the UFC. And of course, she was starching all these people that really, let's just be honest here, had no real business being in the ring with Cyborg. They were feeding her cans because there was nobody really on her level in that weight class. That's what they brought Nunes out for. And then lo and behold, Nunes starches her. So really, Amanda Nunes has quite a bit going for her right now. It's just a matter of, can she put the time in to promote her own fights? Because really, when you have fighters that want to complain about like how they're under-promoted, I always kind of question that, because really, with the access of things like the internet right at your fingertips, like you can go and just put something out on Twitter and you can get an interim belt. Just look at Colby Covington. Granted, Colby Covington is like just scraping the bottoms of society. He is looking for the lowest of common denominators so that he can piss people off. That's what he does. He's a button pusher. He's a button pusher in the same way that, like, let's say, Chael Sonnen with the Brazilians was a button pusher. The only difference being is that Chael Sonnen, he was actually very good at what he did. He was very quick on his feet. And he was very witty. The reason why you can watch guys like Conor McGregor and Chael Sonnen interviews all day is because you never know what they're going to say. You don't have, Chael Sonnen has his catchphrases, one more in the win column, one more for the highlight reel, and one more for the bad guy, all that stuff. But that's more so to end his promos. He doesn't do a lot of, I need to make sure I hit this line, and this line. He comes in with a few pocketed things here and there, obviously, as most any fighter that is privy to press conferences nowadays. But really, a lot of times, you don't know what he's going to say. When Chael's flirting with that reporter in the lead up to his fight, I think it was against Fedor. I mean, that was great. And it went viral. It went viral amongst the MMA community, and for good reason, because Chael's just naturally great. He's great on the mic. He's pretty good in the ring. Whatever you want to say. Or in the cage, I should say. Sorry, I'm a pro wrestling fan, too. But I think that if Nunes, let's say, had the personality of a Chael Sonnen, or even of like a Colby Covington, like if she could get the crowd to hate her or love her, more than they already do, let's say, if she can get her presence out there more than she already has, I really feel that she could be a big household name. I feel that she could be Ronda Rousey 2.0. The only difference is that Ronda Rousey, at times, let's just be honest here, was just insufferable. You had the not shaking Miesha Tate's hand here and there, and the flipping people off of the Ultimate Fighter, and all the different little clip pieces of her in interviews where she's bashing Mayweather and just all this other stuff. She had her real bad moments. And Amanda Nunes is just kind of loved by everybody. I don't know anybody that doesn't like Amanda Nunes. I don't even really I don't go out of my way to watch her fight, and I like Amanda Nunes. You know what I mean? If the fight's on and, I'm already watching the pay-per-view, of course I'll watch her fight. But I don't go out of my way to watch her fight, if that makes sense. Some events I miss, some events I watch. It just kind of all depends. But I like what Nunes is doing. For starters, she's on the highest of highs she could possibly be at right now. And in addition to that, she's also just kind of beloved by everybody. I mean, she's a figure in the LGBT community. She's a figure in the MMA community. She's on a great path right now. If she could extend it a little bit, if she could avoid fading into yesterday's news. She can hold on to what she's got for a little bit longer or even improve it. Let's say she goes out with she has another fight with Cyborg, and she beats Cyborg up again. At that point, basically everything that we're saying about this right now, everybody that's talking about, oh my god, I can't believe she beat Cyborg. If she could go out there and beat Cyborg again, who's currently a free agent, I understand that. But let's say a year or a couple years into the future, Cyborg comes back and they have that Amanda Nunes rematch. If she could go out there and beat Cyborg again, or like submit her or something like that, like, oh, she's the first person to knock her out and the first person to submit her since Cyborg's debut, blah blah blah. It adds more to her presence, and I think that's very interesting. So I love what I love what Nunes is doing right now. I wish the best for Cyborg. I'm just interested to see where things go from here. Is Cyborg going to go to Invicta? Is she going to go to Bellator? Is she going to go to ONE FC? I'm very interested to see kind of where all the pieces fall right now. And I think it's a grave misservice that the UFC isn't keeping Cyborg. So then we got the main event, which is Jon Jones and Alexander Gustafsson, and I'm trying my best to kind of remain objective here, but it's frustrating to me because I see plenty of people that still defend Jones, and at this point, how? Nonetheless, focusing on the fight without going into the drug testing and all the other controversies really that surrounded this fight and the lead up and the fight itself, I would like to reflect on the fight itself, just without anything else. And it was interesting because Jones has shown repeatedly that despite all of his, let's say, advantages, that he's a very crafty fighter. He's one of the craftiest fighters that's ever fought. He's one of the best tactical fighters that's ever lived, regardless of how much he cheats. I'll say that. I also love that he adapts his style to anybody that he fights. He said on Rogan's podcast, one of my more favorite clips, Mind Smash on YouTube made a whole video about it, where he was talking, about how he uses knowledge as a weapon, is how he phrased it. Jon knows just about everything about every fighter that he's ever fought. He goes into great detail. How I study, where. How much do they want to clinch? How much do they want to go for the takedown? What area of the cage they like to shoot? When they shoot, what side their head's going to be at? You know what I mean? Like, what's their first favorite punch? Their second favorite punch? Their third? If they try to take me down, if I get taken down, let's say, what they're going to do when they're on top, blah blah blah. And I find that very interesting because then you see Jon adapt his style to whoever he fights. He constantly has new techniques. He's constantly adding new stuff to his repertoire. He keeps his old things, and he's just adding more into this arsenal that's ever evolving, and I do give him credit for that. I enjoy watching that. I enjoy seeing fighters evolve. You have a guy like, let's say, Dominic Cruz reminds me a lot of that, where his style of constantly bobbing and weaving and moving side to side, moving forward and backward, feints, jabs, lateral movement, forward and backward movement, throwing leg kicks here, throwing takedowns here, like just what he does, it always excites me. I've never seen a boring Dominic Cruz fight. And then you have Cruz he's constantly injured. That's the one thing I can't stand about Dominic Cruz, that he's always injured. But I see some similarities between the two in that their styles are constantly evolving. If you stay put, the sport will catch up to you, and that's what Ronda Rousey found out the hard way, in addition to having a buffoon of a head coach. But it's interesting to me to watch Jones fight, because when he first started, he was essentially just a ground and pound artist. He was a Chael Sonnen, if you will. He was a Mark Coleman style fighter who had some okay striking, and then really he would just take you to the ground and just elbow you into the mat. And then he starts working with Mike Winklejohn down at New Mexico, I think it is, and just within a couple of years, really, like within a year or two, his striking was just exceptionally evolved. He can strike with pretty much anybody in the world now. And so it was fun to see like how this fight was going to play out, because I, along with many, thought that Alexander Gustafsson won the first fight. I initially actually said on my Twitter that I thought that Jones won. I rewatched the fight the day before the rematch, and I thought that Gustafsson won. So it was a close fight, but I think Gustafsson took it. But nonetheless, so it was interesting to see how everything was going to play out. You know, would Gustafsson go out and starch him? I couldn't see that happening, but it'd be interesting if it did, and I wouldn't rule it out completely. Was Jones going to go out there and just dominate? And that's basically what happened for a number of different reasons. It's also just interesting what, like, he comes in. Jones never does the same thing twice, essentially. What you find is that by the time he comes in, he has a game plan that is specifically adapted to whatever techniques you're using, and he essentially shuts your offense down. And again, that's what I see a lot of what Dominic Cruz does, where he takes his style and makes it work to whatever style opponent he's facing. So when I look at that, I see that's the similarity I talk about. But so you have Jones who's coming out, he's backing up against Gustafsson, he's not going into his reach, he's not letting him kind of stay in that pocket, he's constantly throwing that oblique kick, he's constantly throwing that jab, he's moving out of the way, he's essentially just kind of trying to find his timing in the first round or so. And then eventually you see, as the fight goes on, kind of where the fight was going to go. Where, you know, Gustafsson's hurt, his knee's torn up because of that oblique kick, and just really, he doesn't seem like he really has much of a chance in this fight. And then you find out later, you know, why that is, and that Gustafsson was hurt really early on in the fight, and like one of the first exchanges, I think he said. And then, of course, Jones, who we always forget about his ground and pound, and then he takes someone down and just ground and pounds them, and you're like, oh, yeah, there it is. You know, like, he doesn't forget where he came from, so he's not afraid to take the fight to the ground. He's not like, let's say, Damian Maia, who, maybe he's not the best example, but he started with his jiu-jitsu, just pure jiu-jitsu fighter, and he was undefeated, blah, blah, blah. Loses to Anderson Silva, loses to a couple more guys, and then he wins a couple of fights, but he thinks that he's a striker, and so he starts going in there and just trying to strike with everybody, forgetting completely about his jiu-jitsu. Then, lo and behold, he goes down to 170, goes back to what got him to the dance, and lo and behold, he wins 7 fights in a row. It's like 7 or 8. So it's just one of those things that as long as you don't forget your roots, you're probably going to be all right. And then there's fighters like, let's say, Chael Sonnen, who don't really deviate from their usual. You know, if you watch a Chael Sonnen fight, before the fight even starts, you know what's going to happen. Chael's going to go out there, he's going to put his head into his opponent's chest, push him into the cage, and try to take his ass down. And then when he takes him down, he tries to punch him. It's sort of the same with Ben Askren, only Ben Askren's a far superior wrestler to Chael. Well, maybe not far superior, but definitely a superior wrestler to Chael Sonnen. You know, just by record alone, you know, Chael has had his wins and losses, he's had his ups and downs, and, you know, you have a guy like Ben Askren who's, you know, not really lost a round, let alone a fight. You know, like Bellator scored the fight when he beat, was it Lyman Good? They scored it 3 rounds to 2, 4 rounds to 1, and 5 rounds to none. I don't know how you score a single round against Ben Askren in that fight. That was a clean sweep. You look at his fights look at his fights in one, it's basically the same. You look at any of his fights in Bellator, it's basically the same. He comes out, takes you down, and then punches you. So I feel like the best fighters are the ones that evolve. And I feel that when you had Jones, who was doing exactly what he needed to in order to win the fight, and that's essentially what he does in every fight, where he does exactly what he needs to win the fight. He doesn't try to, let's say, shove a square shape into like a round peg, let's say. He doesn't just try to make his style work against anybody and just forces it. He adapts, and he's probably the best adapter, if we can use that word, in the history of the sport. You have Alexander Gustafsson, who's a very, very strong striker, a very dangerous striker. So what does Jones do? He utilizes his reach that he has on everybody. He utilizes the range game. He uses the oblique kick. He uses the jab. He uses his eye poking. He uses his takedown ability, where he essentially just doesn't let Gustafsson stay in the pocket. You saw kind of a similar thing, or a pretty similar thing actually, in the Daniel Cormier-Derek Lewis fight, where DC just would not let Derek Lewis just sit in the pocket with him. That's a terrible idea, unless like you're, you know, extremely confident in your head movement and your blocking ability. But even then, you're playing a weird game there. You know what I mean? And so what did DC do? He never went into the pocket, and if he did go into the pocket, he shot for the takedown. I think he clinched once or twice, but he just never let Derek Lewis get his feet set, essentially. And you saw him doing the ankle pick. You saw him with a basic single leg into a high crotch, and then, turning this way, tripping him up, waiting for him to get back up, tripping him again, trying to drain the gas tank. It's a DC fight. It's what he does. And I think that makes DC one of the greatest ever for that. Just the fact that he has made almost every single opponent he has ever fought look almost powerless. The only fighter he's really had issues with is John Jones, who's a notorious steroid user. So that's why I put DC on my top 5, for instance. But going back to the Jones-Gustafsson fight, Gustafsson looked basically powerless. He looked like in the second round that he was starting to find his range a little bit. He was starting to open up a little bit, but by that point, Jones kind of just had everything under control. And going to the third round, you saw what was going on, and then lo and behold, he takes him down. And even I said to the monitor I was watching on, I immediately just said, as soon as he took him down, I'm like, he's not getting up. If he makes it out of the round, great, but I didn't even think he was going to make it out of the round. I thought that was basically it, and lo and behold, it's pretty on par. So you have these fighters. And to transition off that topic here for a little bit, but you have these fighters that adapt, and then you have the ones that don't. And I find, ironically enough, and I find it ironic, and I'll explain that in a second, that wrestlers are the ones that adapt the most. You have John Jones, who started off as a wrestler, but now he could probably strike with just about anybody on the planet. You have Daniel Cormier, who went from being just a pure wrestler to being able to strike. He's a technician for sure, and then utilizing the clinch more. You have, let's say, a guy like Ben Askren, who's probably the complete opposite example of that, but he also did adapt his game in order to avoid taking damage, so he could get you to the ground. So you have these fighters that are able to incorporate new things into their repertoire. Ben Askren's a Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. He's been training at Rufus Sport up in Milwaukee with Duke Rufus and Anthony Pettis and all these other guys. Where it's a striking-based gym. So lo and behold, after a couple years, he's pretty difficult to hit. But he said that was his game plan going into it, is I know I'm not going to be an elite striker, but I don't need to be. Because if I get you on the ground, or if I get my hands on you, I'm eventually going to get you to the ground, and I'm going to beat your ass. And there you go. Ben Askren, even though his striking is a little bit questionable, and his jiu-jitsu hasn't really been tested very much, he does have a relatively well-rounded game. He just has something that he specializes in and never deviates from, and that's okay when you're 18-0. But I find that the wrestlers, going back to Ben Askren actually, or Ben Askren, who said that when he first started training at Duke's, he did striking with no wrestling. But then when he found the happy medium, he was doing 2 wrestling practices a week with 6 to 7 striking practices a week, and then it went down to 5, I think he said. So you have these people that adapt. And I find usually the people that adapt are wrestlers who understand I'm not going to be able to make it to the very tippy top of the division. I'm not going to be able to be a champion that stays on top for long just by going out and shooting my double. I need to learn at least competent striking skills. I need to learn at least competent jiu-jitsu skills. I need to make sure that I can keep the fight in my realm no matter where it goes. And I find that, let's say, jiu-jitsu practitioners, I got to bring up Damian Maia as much as I love Damian Maia. Damian Maia is arguably the most one-dimensional fighter that's not named Ronda Rousey in the history of the UFC. And that's okay when your jiu-jitsu, when you're a 4th degree Brazilian jiu-jitsu black belt who can basically out-grapple anybody that exists on this planet. When you're that good, that's all well and good. But when you can't take your opponent down, all of a sudden, you're out on an island. So that's why I say the best base for MMA is wrestling. And I feel that it's not specifically wrestling, but it's hard work. And hard work and wrestling go together hand in hand. I've done a good amount of sports in my life, and I'll tell you what, nothing was more difficult than when I did wrestling in 7th grade. my jiu-jitsu practices are very fun, and I enjoy going to them, and my wrestling practices are like they're jiu-jitsu and wrestling. You just kind of, it's a grapple-based school that I go to, and I'll tell you what, those are a blast, and I enjoy every second of them, but they're nowhere near as difficult as my 7th grade wrestling team. So I think that says something, just like the mental toughness that wrestlers have, with their ability to just push through discomfort, to grind through whatever it is they're dealing with, and to just keep it going. And I think that when you have that kind of a mindset and you can adapt it to other, let's say, to other disciplines, I think that's when you start to really see results. Again, I bring up John Jones, I bring up Chael Sonnen to a smaller extent, I bring up Ben Askren, these guys that started out as wrestlers but have really learned to adapt their game. Chael Sonnen, I say that his fights are the same, and they are, but it's not like he doesn't have striking skills. He did outbox Rampage Jackson, which is, he outstruck Anderson Silva, for Christ's sakes. It's interesting to me. I also think that when it comes to other mixed martial artists, like let's say your kickboxers, your boxers, your jiu-jitsu practitioners, whatever the case calls for, oftentimes they don't evolve nearly to the same extent as your average wrestler. And when you look at, I bring up Damian Maia, who, can he strike? Sure. I mean, he can strike in the same way Khabib Nurmagomedov can strike. Sure, they can strike, but they're not going to win a boxing title or a kickboxing title under any rule set. That's just how it is. Whereas John Jones, who can probably strike with just about anybody, like I mentioned earlier. Ben Askren, I don't think he's going to win any boxing titles, but I'll tell you what, he's going to be one hard motherfucker to hit. So there's that too. You have your boxers who don't really learn competent ground skills a lot of times. Maybe not competent ground skills, but they don't become nearly as good on the ground as they should. Edson Barboza, you take him to the ground and he's so-so. You keep him on the feet and he'll kick your body until he'll kick your body senseless. He'll kick your legs senseless. But you take him down, like let's say you catch one of those kicks, you could probably beat him up for 3 rounds and win a decision. Your boxers or your kickboxers, like let's say Derek Lewis in the Daniel Cormier fight. He looked powerless because what did DC do? He went forward, avoided the damage, and eventually got him to the ground and beat him up and then choked him. Derek Lewis at no point looked even slightly a threat to Daniel Cormier, especially when it got to the ground. He maybe looked like a threat when he was whiffing those punches, and it's like, oh, what if one of those hit? But by and large, he just looked powerless out there. And it's because Daniel Cormier and along with these other guys are able to dictate where the fight takes place and take their opponent to somewhere uncomfortable. I feel like your best case scenario is to model your style after someone like, let's say, Anderson Silva, where standing up, he was a genius. He was a virtuoso. He was one of the best strikers in the history of the UFC, for sure. That is not debatable. And then even if you took him down, he just might submit you with his BJJ. Now, for example, in the first Chael Sonnen fight, where, Chael just beat him up for 4 rounds, but then Anderson was never quite out of the fight, and lo and behold, he submits him with about, a minute 50 left. But you have these different fighters that learn other martial arts, and that's when you become the most successful. Think about some of the greatest that have ever done it. Anderson Silva, he's not really in my running because he's tested positive how many times now, but we'll just, for argument's sake, Anderson Silva, George St. Pierre, a lot of people say Mighty Mouse, Cain Velasquez I'll throw in there, like these guys that were seen as the best of the best of the best, or Daniel Cormier, I'll throw him in there for sure. You have these guys that are pretty well-rounded. GSP can strike, especially he's got that damn jab, and also he can take you down and just beat on you for 5 rounds. That's what he does. You have Daniel Cormier, who can definitely strike, and especially at heavyweight, when he knocks out Stipe Miocic, for Christ's sakes. You have Cain Velasquez, who can strike with just about anybody, and then, of course, if he happens to take you down, after he's exhausted you for, 2 minutes, or however long it takes him, he takes you down, and he probably chokes you. You have these guys that are considered the best of the best of the best, and what do they do so well? In addition to adapting, they're also good at applying other martial arts to their style, which is also important. I'll bring up Dominic Cruz again, where you have a guy who essentially he's being offensive and defensive at the same time, which is very interesting, something that really nobody else does. But you also have this guy who, has, according to Eddie Bravo himself, has very good jiu-jitsu. He doesn't show it in his fights very much, but when Eddie Bravo says you have good jiu-jitsu, you probably have really good jiu-jitsu. In addition to that, he has a great wrestling background. You see him take people down and beat on him. I mean, he beat Demetrius Johnson, for Christ's sakes, and dominated him for 5 rounds wrestling. And then, of course, on the feet, you're probably not going to touch the guy unless your camp has been studying him for 10 years. And your head coach has over 30 rounds to work with on film, unless that's the case, you're probably not going to hit the guy very much. So you have the guys that adapt. The best in the world stay on top. And I find that interesting because I feel like it's part of what makes MMA. It's not like it's boxer versus wrestler anymore. That still happens for sure. Like you have this guy who's a specialist on the feet and this guy who's a specialist on the ground. That still happens all the time, but it's not pure martial art versus pure martial art anymore. Everything has been mixed up. It's like a shuffled deck of cards now, and I love that because it adds so many more elements into the game. Of what if Daniel Cormier can outbox this guy who is a jiu-jitsu practitioner. So DC maybe just wants to stay in the clinch with him and strike with him on the feet and maybe don't take him down because you run the risk of being submitted, blah, blah, blah. I find that to be one of the more fun elements of MMA because you have all of these little aspects that come together in one big aspect on Fight Night, which is your style. And I think that the more aspects you have, I think the more fun it makes the sport. It's not the jiu-jitsu guy is not always going to beat the boxing guy. You know what I mean? And I love that. So, in other news, you have of course the whole UFC card being canceled controversy. There was that, but let's go ahead and skip ahead, and we'll just go straight to UFC Fight Night 143. Well, that's not ahead, but I love this Henry Cejudo TJ Dillashaw fight because I feel like Cejudo's fighting for his life and TJ Dillashaw's fighting for his legacy. You have Henry Cejudo, who just beat the greatest flyweight of all time and arguably one of the greatest mixed martial artists of all time. I don't know how good Demetrius Johnson is, to be honest, because like when you saw him, the best fighter he's ever fought, by a country mile, is Dominic Cruz, and Dominic Cruz just absolutely mopped the floor with him. All due respect. I feel like Demetrius was probably a little bit overhyped, and I don't want to throw stones at Demetrius because I like him. I like him a lot, actually. But I feel like he is an adapting, ever-evolving version of Ronda Rousey, who is in a weight class that was still evolving. Again, that doesn't mean that Demetrius isn't good or great, because he is. I just think that the sport, maybe not the sport, but I feel like his division it actually has more contenders at its disposal now. So it was sort of like how Anderson Silva all of a sudden had issues with Chris Weidman, and then he lost to Michael Bisping, and then he lost to this guy, lost to Daniel Cormier. All of a sudden you have these guys where he's not head and shoulders over them anymore. That's all I'm saying. So you have Henry Cejudo, who beat the greatest flyweight of all time, versus TJ Dillashaw, who's one of the top 2 bantamweights of all time. I personally still give my hat to Dominic Cruz, but neither here nor there. They're both amazing. So I very much wonder about this fight, and I wonder who's going to come out on top, because I feel like if TJ Dillashaw comes out on top, he's a 2-weight world champion. All credit to him, and I feel like he's just going to be beating that. He's just going to be beating that same dead horse of I'm the greatest bantamweight. Even though I lost to Dominic Cruz, I'm still the greatest bantamweight. And it'll be interesting to see where things go from there, because maybe he fights. If it's a close fight, maybe he rematches Henry. I wouldn't mind seeing that. Maybe Cruz comes back a little sooner than we thought, and TJ Dillashaw and Dominic Cruz finally have a rematch. It just all depends. Maybe he fights a Sun Sal. Maybe he fights John Lineker. Maybe he fights. We don't know. And I like the unknown aspect, because it's a problem, but it's the best problem you could have. So Henry Cejudo, who is one of the best wrestlers in the company for sure. I don't even think that's debatable. He's one of, if not the best wrestler in the company. An Olympic gold medalist, for Christ's sakes. You know, these guys that are Olympic alternates, which is a huge accomplishment. An Olympic bronze medalist or silver medalist, again, huge accomplishments. Henry got gold, you know, and I mean, when you're able to take down and just pin down Demetrius Johnson for not 5 rounds, let's say 3 rounds, that's very impressive, especially to a flyweight who's only 125 pounds. You know, those guys, you take one wrong move, put one hand in the wrong place, and all of a sudden, like, they spring back up like they got you know, springs in their step, for lack of a better word. Versus TJ Dillashaw, who he still feels to me like he's a little bit more linear version of what Dominic Cruz does, where TJ has to pin you in a corner and then unload on you. So what he did to Cody, that's what he did to Cody again. That's what he did to just like pretty much all of his opponents. What TJ Dillashaw does is he works his lateral movement, and then all of a sudden he has you pinned in a corner and he unloads on you. That's what he does. Whereas Cruz, you never see him get cornered. That's all I'm saying when I say that he's a little bit more linear, and that he has to pin you in the corner. Otherwise, it's just a little bit more of a spread out, sporadic, like little shot here kind of fight. And TJ Dillashaw, you know, statistically doesn't do as well in those fights. You know, he's one of those fighters that has to knock you out, let's say. Whereas, you know, I think a lot of people know now is that if you go for the knockout, if you're like, I am going to go knock this guy out, you will never win a decision. You know, it's what Mark Hunt's taught us. That's what, like, someone like Derek Lewis has taught us. You know, Derek Lewis usually gets the knockout, but nonetheless. You know, that's what Francis Ngannou's taught us. That's what all these fighters have taught us, is that if you can't knock him out, if you're just dead set, you have to knock him out, you'll never win the decision. Excuse me. So it's an interesting dynamic where you have a Dominic Cruz-esque fighter in TJ Dillashaw who's constantly evolving versus Henry Cejudo, who's also constantly improving. I wouldn't say he's evolving. I would say he's improving, though. And you have Henry, who's also just a dynamic wrestler. I wonder who wins this fight, and I'm having issues predicting it. I'm tempted to go with the underdog, Henry Cejudo, because I feel that wrestling is always an advantage unless you just have disgustingly good takedown defense. You know what I mean? And it's not like he's a jiu-jitsu practitioner. Jiu-jitsu practitioners, their takedowns tend to struggle against top-tier opponents. You know, not to say they can't, but to say that more often than not, they have issues and they're forced to stand, and then that's when they get tagged. But you have Henry Cejudo, who's not going to have that issue, and then you have TJ Dillashaw, who's fighting at a weight he never fights at, and he's fighting a better wrestler than he's ever faced. And I mean, come to think of it, you know, Dominic Cruz is nowhere near the wrestler that Henry Cejudo is, and Cruz took him down almost at will. So it'll be interesting to see how that fight plays out. And I want to know what happens if Henry Cejudo beats TJ Dillashaw. Do they still shut down the flyweight division? Do they have a rematch maybe? Does Henry just kind of keep his belt and keep fighting whoever comes up, and does he keep the belt for a little while? Does TJ Dillashaw, if he loses this fight, he goes 16-4 in his career, and does he, let's say, go back to bantamweight and fight Cruz or fight Lineker or fight Marias or Asuncao or whoever the case calls for? I wonder, and I'm interested to find out how that fight plays out, because it's going to be an interesting fight for sure. And I don't think it's going to be a lay and pray fight. You know, people were bitching about the Cejudo Mighty Mouse fight, but it's just, I feel like the people that complain about that fight don't understand MMA, because when it comes to fighting a guy like Demetrius Johnson, who, like I said, is just, he's a flyweight for one, but he's also one of the best in the world at getting up when he's down. You know what I mean? He reminds me a lot of like what Conor McGregor did in his earlier fights. Like when Seaver tried to take him down, and then he just like squirms and gets right back up. Tries to take him down again, gets right back up. Eventually, when you had, let's say, a Chad Mendes who comes in against McGregor, all of a sudden Chad Mendes can take him down pretty easily. Granted, he had a messed up knee, but still. And he wasn't able to get up until that one time where he screwed up, and he was able to get up, and then McGregor knocked him out. I feel like if Dillashaw doesn't find that opening, I feel like Henry Cejudo wins by decision, because I don't think he's going to wear out, and I don't think TJ is going to wear out. So it'll be an interesting fight, and it's an interesting dynamic. And then UFC 233, unfortunately, was canceled, and that sucked because I was really looking forward to this card. There wasn't a main event. That's the only thing I didn't like, and, obviously we see the aftermath now. It got canceled. But, you had Dominic Cruz versus John Lineker, and then obviously Cruz got injured again. That dude just cannot catch a break. Then the big fight I was looking forward to is Robbie Lawler and Ben Askren, because that is, the big opening. This is Ben Askren's chance to finally fight some of these top guys. And I cannot wait. I still can't wait. I can't wait for this Ben Askren-Robbie Lawler fight. I feel like it's a weird opponent to give Ben right out of the gate. I understand it's I don't want to say a tune-up fight. They're giving him a hard fight right off the bat in Robbie Lawler, who's an all-time great welterweight. But I feel like it's weird. I feel like he would have probably gotten Colby first, or what is it? The guy that or Darren Till first, or something like that. Someone who could talk back with Ben Askren, because Ben, who is one of the best in the world at selling and marketing himself, it's what he does. So I wonder why they gave him Robbie over, let's say, Darren Till, or maybe Till was just no, I'm not fighting welterweight anymore, I'm fighting middleweight, blah, 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 which is understandable. He's had so many issues with his weight. He's missed weight, 4 times or something ridiculous like that? I don't know. But you have Ben Askren, who is one of the best wrestlers in the sport. He's Henry Cejudo level, maybe. You have Ben Askren, who has really never lost a round. Can you find a fight where he lost a round? Because I really can't. I just nudged my mic there. Can you find a fight where he's lost a round? Because I haven't been able to. It's been 5-0, 5-0, 3-0. It's been domination after domination when it comes to Ben Askren. He hasn't had a close fight except the Jay Huron fight. Versus Robbie Lawler, who's definitely on a downswing. I was going to say a little bit of a downswing, but he's definitely on a downswing. But he's not done by any stretch of the imagination. That's another reason why I'm not sure why they gave Ben Askren Robbie Lawler first, because Robbie Lawler is already in, let's say, not the best position. And I feel like it really hurts him if he loses to Ben Askren. It's not because Ben Askren's not good or great, because he is, but it's another loss. He was just on top and had the title, what was it, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, something like that? It wasn't that long ago. I understand it's a long time in MMA years, but it was only a couple fights ago for Robbie that he had the belt, and all of a sudden he loses to Tyron. He loses to, I forget who else he lost to, but then all of a sudden he goes against Ben Askren, and let's say he gets taken down and just beat on for 3 rounds. It makes it even worse, you know what I mean? So it's one of those things where you look at it and go, why not just give him, let's say, Till? Till's also on a downswing, granted, but he lost to Tyron Woodley. That's not really a hard loss to it's not a hard loss to eat. It happens. He's the welterweight champion. But I would love to see where things go from here with Ben Askren, because let's say he beats Robbie Lawler. Who do you give him? Do you give him Till? Do you give him Woodley? I would love to see that fight, the Woodley Askren fight. I know it's not going to happen. I'm very aware it's not going to happen. I'm not getting my hopes up for it. I'm just saying it'd be a very interesting welterweight fight. And I would also like to see if they're going to open the 65-75 classes and take out the welterweight class and let's say call 65 welterweight or 75 welterweight. That would be interesting to me, because let's say, because Tyron's talked about moving up anyway. Let's say they make the 75 class, okay, Tyron doesn't have to cut 5 extra pounds. Great. So he moves up to 75, and he keeps fighting at welterweight. You take Askren, you throw him down at 65, and all of a sudden he can fight Kelvin Gastelum. He can fight Robbie Lawler. He can fight, all these guys, Khabib Nurmagomedov can maybe go up to 65. That'd be an interesting fight. Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Ben Askren. I love Ben Askren. I think Khabib mauls him. I'm just saying. But it'd be interesting. And I think that if you bring up the 65-75, there's a lot more wiggle room, and also you can finally give Ben Askren a belt, who deserves a belt more than anybody in the UFC that does not have a belt. Except maybe Stipe Miocic, but DC knocked him out fair and square. So I look at that. That was an interesting card, and it just sucks that it doesn't come to fruition. So there's UFC Fight Night 144. I haven't seen this card yet, so I'm actually looking through it right now for the first time. Oh no, I've seen these. So Javier Sunsal versus Marlon Rice. That's gonna be an interesting fight. Damian Maia versus Lyman Good. That's an interesting fight. Jose Aldo, Ronaldo Moicano. I don't know. undefeated prospect versus probably the greatest featherweight of all time, except maybe like Max Holloway. That'll be an interesting fight. This doesn't feel like it feels like a fight night. It doesn't feel like a pay-per-view. It feels like a fight night, and that's why it is a fight night, I guess. But I look for certain matchups that really I could just cling on to and just like can't wait until they happen. You know, Conor McGregor, Khabib Nurmagomedov was a great example of that. I was so pumped for that fight, and then the fight delivered. I understand it was a couple months ago, but to skim over it real quick, I mean, like, that fight was pretty much what I expected. It wasn't like I would have been shocked I would have been shocked to a certain extent if Conor won, but I mean, Conor is also, he's one of the best strikers in the UFC. He's one of the best strikers in UFC history. And so, like, if you hear, like, you wake up the next morning and you hear, Khabib got caught, Conor beat him. It's like, is it really so hard to believe? Because to me, it's not. You got Jose Aldo, Renato Moicano. That's another fight that, like, Jose Aldo, I mean, he just smashed Jeremy Stephens. Like, that was a hard fight to watch. Because I thought Jeremy Stephens was going to win. I was just, for the sake of it, basically, I was just rooting for the upset. I felt the upset was imminent because of Aldo, the way he's been on a downswing as of late. I mean, lost to Conor in very epic fashion. Lost to Max Holloway, lost to Max Holloway again, and just all of a sudden it's like, okay, where does he go from here? And he's going to fight Jeremy Stephens, who hits like a freaking freight train. It's like, I don't know who takes that one. And then Jose Aldo just goes out there and dismantles him, and like, he hit him so hard, and I think it was the ribs of the body, that he takes a couple steps back and then just crumbles. Like, that was a crazy ending to the fight. So I even put on Facebook, well, I'm never doubting Jose Aldo again, that's for sure. So I look forward to this fight. I look forward to these upcoming couple cards. I can't wait for Francis Ngannou and Cain Velasquez. That is an epic fight. I'm a huge Cain Velasquez fan, and I'm also a huge Francis Ngannou fan. So it's one of those things where, like, I don't want to root for anybody, because I don't want to draw, and I also don't want either of these guys to lose. Because if Francis Ngannou loses, he's lost, 3 of his last 4? Or 2 of his last 3? Something like that? No, 2 of his last 3. No, 3 of his last 4. No, now I got it. It's one of those things where you just go, okay, well, why would you maybe not feed Francis Ngannou to Cain, but it's like, I understand it's a real big fight, and it's a real interesting fight, and I know fans want to see it. It's probably going to draw pretty well. Because, I mean, Cain, he's not the biggest draw in the world, but he is a draw, as well as Francis Ngannou. I feel like they're both just, like Cain definitely is a main eventer, and I feel like Francis Ngannou is still barely a main eventer. So I feel like both these guys have they have so much to gain, but they also have so much to lose. You have Francis, who he would lose 3 of his last 4, and just really, he would kind of just be out of the spotlight at that point, unless he, like, starts touting off, like, more 20-second knockouts. He wins, like, his next 3 fights by, like, 20-second knockout. Okay, fine. But I feel like he'll lose a good bit of his star power if he loses this next fight. And Cain Velasquez needs this fight for redemption, really. Because he's been out since UFC 200, which was 2016. And I understand Cain's been wanting to get back in the octagon for some time, and that's all well and good. But at the end of the day, you've been gone forever. You've been gone for quite a while. And MMA fans have some of the shortest memories I've ever seen in my life. And so you look at Cain Velasquez, who I think, my opinion for what it's worth, is probably the greatest heavyweight of all time. He is just he's a terrifying, terrifying man. He will go forward. He will just beat you down. He has the best cardio I've ever seen. Well, from a heavyweight at least. Like, he has the cardio of, like, a welterweight or a lightweight. It's crazy. He'll have a 5-round war with Junior Dos Santos, and going into the 5th round, he's still not even breathing heavy. It's terrifying. So this fight goes past 1 round. Cain Velasquez wins, and there is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. There is no chance that Francis Ngannou wins past the 1st round. That said, though, if this fight ends in a 1st-round stoppage, it's Francis Ngannou. So it's one of those things where, where Cain Velasquez needs this victory, and Francis Ngannou needs this victory. Now, and it's not like a draw is going to help either of them. So, like, someone has to lose here. I feel like Ngannou, and Cain Velasquez both come out of the gate guns blazing, essentially. Only difference being between the two is that Cain Velasquez can keep that pace for 20 rounds, whereas Francis Ngannou, he tires out after the first round. I'm sure he's worked on that a little bit since the Stipe fight, and you saw that you saw in his fight against Derek Lewis, he looked terrible, and then he goes in the fight against Curtis Blades, who I firmly believed was going to beat Francis Ngannou as well. I felt that Curtis was going to come out, he's going to take him down, just beat on him. He's going to chael son him for 3 rounds. And then, of course, Francis Ngannou comes out, throws like one right hand, and it was a punch that Curtis basically blocked, and he still got knocked out. Like, it was crazy. So you look at Ngannou, he has that ability that very few fighters have, where he could beat anyone in the world if he lands one shot, and it can even be a sloppy shot that his opponent basically blocks. It could still knock them out. It's crazy. I understand that there's plenty of fighters that have that power, or that have great power. Francis Ngannou has otherworldly power. You saw DC versus Derek Lewis. Derek Lewis, he hit him a couple times, but they were blocked shots. He didn't have to eat a single bomb. Whereas Francis Ngannou, if he lands a punch, even if you block it almost completely, it could still knock you out. He's a different animal, man. I mean, Francis, he has the world's hardest punch for a reason, So, this fight intrigues me on a number of levels, because Cain Velasquez hasn't been known to take a punch or two in his fights. You saw that in the first Junior Dos Santos fight, where he got knocked out. He had a real bad knee injury, and I understand all that, but it's still worth mentioning. In the second fight, I mean, he took a couple shots, but nothing too bad. In the third fight, he took a couple of shots, and he was able to keep going and won and retained his belt. If Francis Ngannou lands one of those shots, I don't think Cain's going to be around. I don't really think anybody can deal with Francis Ngannou's power if he lands a clean shot, or at least if he lands a somewhat clean shot. The closest thing we've seen to it is Francis' fight against Stipe Miocic, where in the first round he landed a couple of those big shots. They were like glancing blows, or maybe they landed at 50% or so. And even then, Stipe looked like he was he was out on his feet, and that's why he shot in for that big takedown, and he landed it, thankfully. If Francis Ngannou had better takedown defense, I do think that he would have beaten Stipe on that night. It's not to say that maybe he would have beaten him in the rematch per se, but I feel that he would have won on that night if, on UFC, was it 220, I think it was, if he had better takedown defense. So it's an interesting dynamic with Francis and Cain, because you have a prospect who's looking to keep his star power, to keep his ability to, intimidate people for one, but he had an awful performance against Stipe. I mean, he looked great in the first round. It's a terrifying first round. And then rounds 2 through 5 were just kind of Stipe. Then he had the worst fight in maybe MMA history against Derek Lewis. And then he's on the road. He's on the road to a comeback, because he did knock out and just, crushed, really, Curtis Blades, who he knocked him down, I think it was 3 times in 6 or 7 seconds. Crazy. And by the way, it was not an early stoppage. Anybody that was saying it was an early stoppage, that stoppage was completely fine. So he's on the road to a comeback, and then you have Cain Velasquez, who's also trying to start a comeback. So really, both these guys need this fight. I feel like Cain could take this loss, and it really wouldn't tarnish his legacy, because it's he got knocked out by Francis Ngannou. No shit. Versus Francis Ngannou, he may lose some of his star power forever if he loses to Cain Velasquez. But it's not like it's a tough loss. Cain Velasquez is arguably the best heavyweight of all time. So it's this weird dynamic, like I said, between these two. And that's why I love this fight so much, but it's at the same time why I don't want either guy to lose. So it's a real tough position to be in. Also, you got, I believe Ben Askren is fighting on UFC 235, is it? Yeah. Yeah, okay. I was just checking because I want to make sure that wasn't on the Ngannou Velasquez card. Although that'd be cool too. You got Francis Ngannou, Cain Velasquez, Robbie Lawler, and Ben Askren on the same card. That's some cool stuff. But I look forward to a lot of these fights that we have coming up, and I really can't make sense of a lot of them, but I enjoy the unknown aspect. You have a guy like Cain Velasquez, who is one of the best that has ever done it, versus an up-and-comer, a big prospect, and one who just kills people. And then you got a guy like, let's say, Robert Whittaker versus Kelvin Gastelum, which is another big fight. And then Israel Adesanya versus Anderson Silva. I can't really call either of those fights. I think Robert Whittaker beats Kelvin Gastelum. But really, when you look at Israel Adesanya versus Anderson Silva, that is one of the more interesting fights of the year, in my opinion. Just to touch on that, because you have Israel Adesanya versus, who's an excellent striker, versus Anderson Silva, who's one of the greatest strikers of all time. Finally, Anderson Silva's got to be looking at this fight going, well, great, I don't have to fight a person that's just going to come out and try to take me down for 3 rounds or try to clinch with me for 3 rounds. This guy wants to stand and bang with me, and that makes it interesting, because nobody has ever fought Anderson Silva, stood and banged with him, and won. Nobody. You had Chael Sonnen, who was able to outstrike him, but then immediately went for the takedown, as he should have. You had Chris Weidman, who, he kept up with Anderson, but it's not like he was outstriking him or anything like that. But nobody's been able to outstrike Anderson Silva, and that makes it interesting, because you have an undefeated prospect who is an excellent striker who's constantly evolving in Israel Adesanya. I feel like this could be a real changing of the guard. I feel like if Anderson Silva wins, he's next in line for a title shot against Robert Whittaker. And then, if he beats Robert Whittaker, oh my God, what a freaking comeback. But then if Israel Adesanya wins, he's probably next in line for a title shot. And you have an undefeated monster versus Robert Whittaker, who's a middleweight monster. Pretty much since he went from welterweight to middleweight, he's been just killing everybody. So the middleweight division is also something I'm really interested in right now. And I wonder, who's going to be the middleweight champion by, let's say, June or July or August or September, in that general area where the winner of Israel and Anderson fights the winner of Whittaker-Gastelum. And like I said, I don't think Kelvin beats Whittaker, but I'm not going to rule it out. I'll be pretty surprised, though, because it's not like Kelvin's a bad fighter. He's not a bad fighter by any stretch of the imagination. He's a very good fighter. But he's very basic in a lot of what he does. A lot of his striking is, simple 1-2s. When he goes for his takedowns and whatnot, they're pretty basic double singles. He's not, he's like Damian Maia in a way, in that he knows the basics better than most people. If you look at Damian Maia's jiu-jitsu, it's super high level. Don't get me wrong, but a lot of times what makes him so good is that his basics are so much better and so much more clean and crisp, and his technique is just out of this world. There's no fat in his movements. There's no, oh, I should have put my hand here. He knows exactly where to put his hands, where to put his feet, where to push the knee, where to do this. He does it so much better than everyone. So that's why that's what I think makes Kelvin interesting, is that he does a lot of that, and then in that his striking is very basic, but he does it effectively and with no real fat in his movement. Versus Robert Whittaker, who's just a mauler, really. Well, maybe not a mauler, but he's a killer. He went through everybody at middleweight and just demolished all of them. So it's a case where now that Whittaker's got the belt, man, he had those 2 wars with Yoel Romero, but really, now that he's kind of cleared everybody out, the only real people he's got left to fight are Israel Adesanya, Kelvin Gastelum, and Anderson Silva. And past that, man, I don't really know who else there's left. Maybe I'm missing someone out that's really obvious, but maybe Darren Till now that he wants to fight at middleweight, but I'm not totally sure. And I'm very interested to see where it goes from here. So I think that there's a lot in MMA to look at right now. I think there's quite a bit that's interesting. A lot of people, this is another year where blah, 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 blah. I think that people need to really give the UFC credit, because they're putting on some big fights this year. I look forward to Conor McGregor's comeback. I do happen to believe that he'll be back at some point this year or maybe early next year. I don't necessarily think it's going to be the rematch with Khabib Nurmagomedov, at least not quite yet. I do think that rematch will happen at some point. I do think so. I do want to see, though, where things go from here with Conor McGregor, with Khabib Nurmagomedov. George St. Pierre comes back and he fights Khabib Nurmagomedov, that's easily going to be the biggest fight of all time. It's going to be bigger than Nate Nick, or excuse me, it's going to be bigger than Conor Nate. It's going to be bigger than Conor Habib. This is going to be the biggest fight of all time if GSP and Habib happens. And I happen to think Habib will win. I very much look forward to see where the middleweight division goes from here, where the welterweight division goes from here. If they make the 65 and the 75, if you bring back Stipe Miocic this year, that'll be crazy. I'd love to see a rematch with DC and Stipe. I'd love to see a rematch with DC and, to a smaller extent, DC and Jones, because I don't want to see DC get beat by a guy who's a notorious steroid user again. But we'll see what happens. So I very much look forward to this, and I love the fights that are coming up, and I will be back every single Friday to talk to you guys about it. So, my name is Gage Ryan. I hope you guys enjoyed the first episode of Contender, and you can follow me on Facebook, on Twitter, on SoundCloud, every single little link that your little heart desires. You can find, they're all linked right now on my on this video playing on YouTube. You can follow me at Contender Cast on various social media outlets. I'll have them all in the description as well. So thank you guys for watching the first episode. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and we'll see you guys next time.